make the recording available to participants on the project website following today's event. The breakout groups will be recorded for notes purposes, but we're not going to make those breakout group discussions part of the publicly available recording. Instead, we'll be posting notes from those breakout group sessions. Video is optional, definitely encouraged during the breakout group sessions, but during this presentation for the next 20 minutes or so, purely optional. So to get settled in, I encourage you to go find your chat box if you haven't found that already. We're not going to do introductions with this large group since we are well over 100 participants at this point, but just finally ask everybody to update your name on your little profile box, as well as your organization, so that folks can know who's on the call. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rob with the Resilience Office for a few introductory remarks.
All right, hey everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great, perfect. Well, my name is Rob Presley. I am the Resiliency Program Manager here in the Colorado office, and I am super excited for today's Resiliency Summit. I want to thank all of you for participating today. I know a number of you had participated in the first summit, and it was a fantastic conversation, and really looking forward to the breakout sessions later on in this session, where we're going to go through a couple different scenario exercises and kind of test some of the strategies that we've been developing over the last few months to be included in the update for the framework. To kick us off, we have actually a video from Governor Polis that we'd like to share with you. He just has a few words for participants today, and with that, Shelby, if you want to go ahead and hit play on the video.
Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to kick off today's Resiliency Summit. I'm thrilled that our Colorado Resiliency Office has gathered a broad group of folks from across the state to be here today. We have representation from the state, from local government, from federal partners, from housing partners, from land and water conservation, from ag, just for a few. Your insights are critical for our resiliency framework. The successes from the original framework are reflected in our recovery from the 2013 floods, with a focus on really affecting local economic conditions. Today's work will help make sure that this framework is even better. The COVID pandemic has affected every facet of life. Because of COVID, we're really more interconnected virtually than ever before. We're faced with challenges to our society, including equity and health and economy. And as a result, the leaders here are assembled to help us figure out the activities and programs we need to help make sure that we can be resilient. I'm encouraged by your enthusiasm and flexibility in times like these. The scenarios and exercises that you're working through now will be our opportunity to test your great ideas. Colorado is at the forefront of resiliency, and with your help, we will continue to. Your work today will move the needle on resiliency and protect the things that we value in our great state. Thank you.
Great. Excellent, thank you. And with that, I would also like to pass the mic over to Rick Garcia, who is the Executive Director here at the Department of Local Affairs, to also give a few opening remarks.
Thank you, Rob. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yeah, Rick, you were good.
Great. As Rob indicated, I'm Rick Garcia, the Executive Director in the Colorado Department of Local Affairs. I also would like to thank Governor Polis for that great video recording. And I want to echo the challenges that the governor reflected upon. It's clear that our recent experiences with the pandemic and other social challenges really frame the importance of this great opportunity to come work together to fine-tune and bring your ideas and develop impactful strategies that will make Colorado more resilient for a future environmental, economic, and better social environment. These strategies that this group will shape today will undoubtedly require coordination and partnership. And I encourage everyone to approach today's activities in a very collaborative and innovative spirit. I'm excited to see just such a broad group of participants. Thank you for participating from all sectors throughout our state. Diversity in our stakeholder representation is so critical to create the creative solutions and ideas to deal with the challenges in a more holistic way. As the governor indicated, we have some bold plans to implement strategies that will move the needle for the next 5 years. The plan for the last 5 has been, I think, has served us well, but we obviously have some new challenges, particularly with COVID-19, that I know will be incorporated into the new framework. We need to build off your individual knowledge, your background, your experience, and leverage this to incorporate important work going forward. So with that, let me invite you to roll up your sleeves if you have sleeves on today, and let's get to work in shaping these bold updates for Colorado's resiliency framework. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Rick. Appreciate those comments. At this point, I'm actually going to turn things over to Ann Miller, who is the director of the Colorado Resiliency Office.
Thank you, Rob. And a big thanks to Governor Polis and Director Rick Garcia for kicking off our second Resiliency Summit. And most importantly, thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to roll up your sleeves and join us today to continue this really important work. So you guys have heard this before. Resiliency, definition, the ability of communities to rebound, positively adapt to, and thrive amidst changing conditions or challenges. Okay, we're living through that right now. We're all really getting intimately familiar with what it means to be personally, professionally resilient in this time of uncertainty. And we have the opportunity to innovate, to reimagine, and even accelerate forward as we craft solutions for the future. Next slide. So this is our wake-up call and opportunity to be strategic and proactive. The first Colorado Resiliency Framework in 2015 was shaped by the recovery challenges caused by the fires and the 2013 floods. And now we are in the midst of what feels like I said, the ultimate resiliency challenge. We are facing intense shocks and stressors, this pandemic, and the equally devastating challenges of climate change, systemic inequality, ongoing drought, to name a few. So as we envision and plan for the future we want, I invite you to be thoughtful, be creative, and dream. We need all hands on deck to be successful. So your commitment to take actions on the solutions we craft is imperative. So again, thank you for joining us, because we're gonna need everybody. Next slide. Okay, so I'll spend a few minutes orienting us to where we're at in the framework update process, and then I'll hand it over to Judy Dorsey from the Brendel Group, who will introduce the scenario planning activity today. After that, we'll break into groups for about an hour, and then we'll reconvene to hear a summary from each of the breakout groups, and then wrap up the summit by 4 o'clock. And don't forget the optional digital happy hour from 4 to 4:30. We'd love to see you. So just stay on the Zoom meeting if you're interested. Next slide. Since we kicked off this update planning process with that first Resiliency Summit back in April, we've been hard at work in sector-based teams. This summit provides us an opportunity to zoom out and work across sectors. Today, we're going to look at some of the major themes and risks and vulnerabilities that emerged from the first summit and discuss potential resiliency strategies. Next slide, please. The update is at the core of our office, the Colorado Resiliency Office's charge to infuse resiliency into state agency efforts and investments, as well as help communities prepare for and recover from disruptions and build back better. And I know many of the folks on the call today are from state agencies that have done the hard work and are working really hard now, as well as communities that are living this, whether they're recovering from the 2018 fires and now facing monsoon threats and post-fire flooding risks, to all of us that are working tirelessly to support communities as we adapt in this time of uncertainty. We're also really pleased to have the Brendel Group as our project consultant. In addition, we've got about a dozen volunteers from across state agencies and partners that have stepped up to serve as leaders in our 6 sector groups. They are helping convene sector teams and synthesizing ideas and providing strategic direction. Finally, the Center for Risk-Based Community Resilience Planning, housed out of CSU, is providing insight from national research and from other communities and across the country. Next slide. During this phase of the project, we reviewed the 2015 framework, including accomplishments that many of you contributed to. Thank you. This summer, we're exploring potential strategies to address the state's most pressing risks and vulnerabilities. Throughout the project, we'll be engaging with this group as well as stakeholders across the state. If you have an event or group that could help inform or support these efforts, please contact us. And then in the fall, we'll be prioritizing these strategies and then aligning on the implementation roles and responsibilities. That's the real work. We want you guys to step up, be willing to put your name next to the solutions. The third summit then will focus on coalescing around those high impact strategies and an action plan. And we'll end the year with an updated Colorado Resiliency Framework to guide our collective efforts for the next 5+ years until the next update. Next slide. At the first summit, we gathered concepts for the overall vision for the framework. And since that time, we've iterated with the sector teams and developed this vision statement. It is our job today to think big about those creative solutions towards this vision, focus on building strong, adaptive, and equitable communities. Next slide. We've worked to update and refresh the goals from the 2015 framework as well and reflect the stakeholder feedback we've gotten to date. The goals include mitigating risk, building capacity and collaboration, advancing those policies, investments, and a culture that fosters resiliency and equity. Next slide. 3 primary themes have emerged out of the input so far and capture a range of chronic stressors and potential shocks facing the state. Social equity, economic vibrancy, reducing risks are the 3 themes. Climate change impacts overlays all of this by exacerbating many of these risks and vulnerabilities. And at the center are the 6 interconnected sectors. So we aim to develop solutions that span across all the sectors to maximize resiliency outcomes and co-benefits. This emphasis on cross-sector strategies will help us develop those innovative and impactful solutions we've been talking about to help the state and its communities adapt to and thrive in the face of adversity. And we have a lot of that right now. Next slide. From the first summit and subsequent sector-based team meetings, we compiled a long list of strategies and great ideas that you guys generated to help advance the sector-based missions and the framework vision and goals. Working with sector leadership teams, we've been synthesizing this long list into a consolidated and prioritized list of roughly right now about 60 strategy groupings by sector. From that list of groupings, we started to observe some common threads and ideas across sectors. Some of these common solutions are highlighted on this slide to give you a sense of progress based on your input to date. And then today, in the following scenario planning exercise, you'll help us further shape focus areas in the plan. So now let me turn it over to Judy from the Brundle Group to set us up for our scenario breakout discussions. Thank you all again for being here today.
Perfect, thank you, Anne.
Judy, we had to freeze a little bit there. Can you hear us now?
I was a little. You guys hear me now?
We can. Yep.
You can move to the next slide, please. I wanted to scenario planning and how we dive into our exercise. So scenario, number of factors that make predicting the future difficult. And as Anne just described, we are in that situation with this framework update. There's just so much uncertainty over the next 5 years in this update. And so the idea of scenario planning is to create a range of futures based on all of that uncertainty and to really do the hard work of testing our great ideas against this range of futures to make sure that the likelihood of us achieving our vision and our goals that Anne described, as well as the mission statements for each sector that were provided in your packet, to ensure that those things will be met, even with all the uncertainty that could knock us off course. And so if our ideas perform well under a range of future uncertainties, then they're more robust, and we know that our plan becomes more robust. So I wanted to give a particular thanks to the CSU Center of Excellence in Risk-Based Community Resilience, because they've been the ones who've been challenging us that we can't be planning for the current crisis or the last crisis. We need to be planning for a range of futures in 2025. So with the next slide, we started to think about what are the drivers of change that we need to be thinking about in updating the resilience framework. Anne had showed you our diagram where we have these three cross-cutting themes. And our team, with your help, has been hard at work looking at the different vulnerabilities and risks that could knock us off course relative to our three themes. So there are over a dozen different things that could present challenges and further uncertainty as we look to make our state more resilient. So in the next slide, we took all of these risks and vulnerabilities, or these drivers of change, and started to coalesce them into three different scenarios. And I'm about to introduce the three particular scenarios, and these were also provided last week as part of the summit packet, and we'll go into them in more detail. But before we dive into the specifics of the scenarios, I really wanted to also zoom out a little bit on the scenario planning and really hearken Governor Polis and Anne and other remarks to date, where really what we're trying to do with this exercise is to tap our collective creativity to really think big and solve for a positive future. When we introduce these scenarios, they're going to be pretty dark. They're stark. They're the reality that we need to be dealing with. But collectively, we have the creativity to think big and solve. The idea is to bring Colorado's risks and vulnerabilities to life through this interactive exercise so that we can really be envisioning these strategies in use under different conditions. Research shows us that this helps us remove biases, and it also helps people to be more open to ideas when we're picturing them in really tangible, specific scenarios. So the spirit of this exercise is to let things flow freely, to be organic, to be interactive, to be engaging with each other, to bring your daily expertise, but also dissociate a little bit from your day-to-day job and really be picturing 2025, and maybe have the freedom in that dissociation to maybe embrace some other perspectives outside of your professional realm that you may not always consider. So with that, the next slide starts to get into our actual exercise. We took all of those drivers for change and coalesced them into these three scenarios, A, B, and C. But for each working group that you'll be divided into here shortly, we wanted for each working group to start with 7 basic assumptions, and then each scenario from there gets a little bit unique to that scenario. So walk with me on this journey. It's not 2020, it's 2025. The COVID health crisis has largely passed, but we continue to recover in its aftermath from widespread social and economic impacts. Climate change does not pay attention to COVID. Things have continued to progress with regard to the effects of climate change. Colorado continues to be a place for high cost of living and a tight urban housing market. And while we've had some success in reducing healthcare costs and increasing access to healthcare, we don't have universal coverage yet as a reality. These various dramatic shifts have occurred in terms of police reform and criminal justice, but really structural racism and severe socioeconomic inequalities still persist. So we're making some progress, but a lot of our systemic issues are still with us. And finally, we have bright spots. We are leaders in various areas, including access to broadband infrastructure and renewable electricity, but we still have some coverages and gap coverages and accessibility for all Coloradoans. So that's what all of us will be dealing with as we dive into our scenarios. And then the next slide, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because you'll have time to really sink into these scenarios with your facilitators and digest what they mean. But in the next slide, scenario A, so about a third of us will be randomly assigned to small working groups looking into scenario A. In scenario A, we're experiencing prolonged and severe drought, long periods of extreme heat, therefore wildfires are more frequent and intense. And despite all of that, our state is still in a population growth mode. While we think it's bad here in Colorado, it's worse in other places, and we have a net increase in population growth, both from the economic mobility that has been brought on post-COVID, but also due to climate-induced migration. So that's what the group in scenario A will be looking at. By contrast, the next slide gets into scenario B, which we know is that we have the potential around more extreme temperature events and more erratic hazard events, hail, flooding, winter storms. And this causes property losses and displacement from these events. And so we have increased a number of people experiencing homelessness. So a little bit more erratic situation in scenario B, and housing becomes a serious concern. Scenario C is no more rosy. We have to do the hard work of picturing all the potential futures so that we can create our collective will and expertise to drive into a more resilient and positive future. But nonetheless, scenario C starts to get into some situations around decline. Economic decline, Colorado's tourism and agriculture industries are in decline. Rural and mountain communities are especially hard hit. And this difficult time really does contribute to severe socioeconomic inequalities and therefore widespread conflict and civil unrest. So that's the journey in which we're embarking today. The next slide talks about our breakout groups. In each breakout group, we'll have 3 conversations, one conversation to really get into this scenario and share our respective viewpoints of what does that mean? What are the impacts from from your scenario that you're in? What are some of those secondary impacts? What are some maybe positive silver linings or upsides or insights from some of these scenarios? Then the next conversation will go into the solutions. What are those ideas that will help us be more resilient to these scenarios? And then we'll close it out with a synthesis so that we'll get to hear back from, looks like we'll have about 7 breakout groups today. So it'll be really interesting to compare notes and just really test the ideas of cognitive diversity, and under the same instructions, what different groups come up with in terms of creative ways to help us be positively and proactively addressing these 3 scenarios. So with that, I'm going to, I believe, turn it over to in the next slide. Is it Sarah or Shelby who are going to orchestrate us into our respective breakout group?
We've got about 25 minutes for some report outs. We've got 7 groups, so we're going to keep it to about 3 minutes per group. And so we're going to start with the scenario A teams. We had 2 of those. We had 3 scenario B teams and 2 scenario C teams. So from each group, we're looking for just a quick synopsis of the scenario that you were assigned. Just a quick synopsis of some of the impacts and cascading effects, both positive and negative, from that scenario. And then which solutions did you prioritize? And so let's start with the A group that had Anne and Amy at the helm, and we'll hear from you first.
All right, I guess
take it away.
All right, this is Chris Lemay with Department of Local Affairs. You know, of course, we talked about some of the obvious things that I think everybody would expect, but one of the things that we were somewhat talking about as we wrapped up was really a lot of the impacts. How would we fund those? And based on some of the financial circumstances we have in the state of Colorado that, as part of the scenario planning, we should be thinking about, Gallagher and Tabor and things like that. Land use planning, of course, was catamount, and trying to address the impacts from either a water conservation component, promoting different types of development, minimize the risks. Some of the other impacts, we were concerned about, some of the disruption that would come from the events, and would have some impact on equity within the different members of our society, and how we would address some of those. The scenario had both high growth coming at a time when you were experiencing drought and wildfire potential that we started to have a conversation about affordable housing. I don't know that we came up with any solutions on that particular topic, but we did also start to kind of cover economic, diversification, because there was the impacts that it would have on the tourist economies, both river rafting, for instance, shorter ski season, things like that. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything, or feel free.
I think partnerships and funding and investment were just two things we just kept coming back to, as well as the scenario gave us the opportunity to explore the connections between all of the sectors, especially around watersheds and natural resources and infrastructure and community. Just that, I think the scenario really allowed us to kind of explore the cascading risks and interconnections pretty well. So thanks for that opportunity.
Okay. Let's move over to the other group A that had Melody, Casey, and the rest of the crew. And again, scenario A is the hot wildfire in-migration scenario.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby. So we talked quite a lot about just kind of all the interrelated impacts of wildfires and drought, and how wildfires have pretty significant impacts on both air and water quality, but also the economy, and also how degraded forest health contributes to some of those considerations. We talked about just in general decreased water supply as it relates to drought, but also with increased population growth and everything, and the impacts on all of those things on kind of underserved and unhoused communities, and what that means in terms of social and environmental justice. As far as solutions, we talked quite a bit about water conservation measures, and really ensuring that that's at the consideration of developments, and but also talked about reuse, and really trying to drive the Colorado Water Plan measures that are in there to help with some of the water conservation, and considering that early on in planning for developments. We talked about ensuring healthy forests by providing investment, and then also through the, I believe it's the community wildfire plans that kind of done at a local level, and just making sure that those are kept up to date, and lots of folks have those. As it relates to equity and some of that, we talked about including planning processes that are really driving at some of the equity, and so it's not a side consideration, but it's really integrated throughout the whole opportunity, and getting some of that stakeholder engagement things early on. Workforce development opportunities came up. And finally, we talked a lot about tools and technical assistance for local governments, but then also ensuring that there's a lot of statewide commitments and systems in place, and investment into those processes to really promote that statewide. Is there anything else anyone would add from our group?
We're getting chat thumbs ups. Okay, let's move to the scenario B, folks, starting with Judy and Megan and John.
Sure. So as far as the largest impacts we had on ours, I think with respect to housing, it really has to do with the lack of supply and just all of the constraints on that, and just all of the fragility that people would have, kind of this spiral of like homelessness and mental health issues, economic instability, displacement from their homes, and then also from their community if there's nowhere else to go within their home. Some of the other impacts that we saw had to do with natural resources such as water, which is just going to be so unique in different parts of the state, but just seeing how finite that resource is and how that would maybe drive growth or make some areas more vulnerable and less resilient. So those were some of the biggest impacts we identified. Kind of a downer, but I think that we did have some good optimistic, realistic ways of looking at some solutions. So some of those with respect to housing, we wanted to talk about adaptive reuse of things that would become obsolete, like maybe old like strip malls, shopping centers, offices, big box, things like that, historic buildings. So maybe pairing like historic and adaptive reuse to just build more supply of housing at different price points in the community. The second thing we had talked about was this agriculture. Some conversation going macro, talking about like export as an economic development tool, but then some also coming really micro as far as just having more self-reliance in the community and just more access to like local supplies. The third item that we talked about was using data to identify vulnerable populations, both before incidents happen and then also afterwards. So some of the tools that we're currently using, things like the Vulnerability Index, to help understand that. The fourth item that we talked about was really this green economy and some of these opportunities. And then kind of looking at things like workforce training, maybe apprenticeships, maybe like a conservation corps type model, kind of also tying in maybe with the green economy, but also had some conversations about healthcare, both maybe training people on the production end and then also on the delivery of services, like on the consumer end. So I think healthcare could be like a solution, basically just rethinking the way we're doing healthcare and how it could be better than it is right now. And then the last one, and I'm really sorry if I'm forgetting other people's details in here, but I think just with the idea of community participation, if we had some kind of top down of like getting resources to the local communities and then also really engaging people in the community to be more participatory. So I think there's building trust with institutions and just helping people kind of advocate for the future they want to see in their community and trying to align resources to help make that happen so that when these incidents happen, people aren't so dislocated from their community. And I know I'm forgetting something and I'm really sorry because we had a lot of good discussion.
Did a nice job covering the bases. Does anybody else from your group want to chime in? Okay. Hearing none. Next up, Sebastian's going to report on our group's conversation.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to echo a lot of the same things that Megan just talked about. So first of all, in impacts, we're going to experience the pronouncement of pre-existing social disparities. You know, historically disadvantaged and unresourced communities, BIPOC communities are going to be hit harder by this scenario. Next, economic disparities, small business challenges. Small business challenges will basically fall into two categories: facing competition and then adjusting generally to the effects of this scenario. Next, you're going to face multifaceted infrastructure and built environmental damage and interruption. This can include things, for example, like housing, bridges, increased stresses on the waste system, and increased stress on our emergency response system with more effects of this scenario. Increased pressure on state and local governments, especially both in terms of efforts and capacity, as well as revenue. You'll see, decreased, for example, sales tax revenue during a scenario such as this one. And lastly, it impacts housing. There's going to be more homeless, and pre-existing homeowners and residents will experience and have to adapt their housing to the effects of this scenario. The solutions that we proposed this scenario, bringing those impacted into the conversation solutions was a great point brought up by one of our members. And it means bringing stakeholders to the table. What was talked about before, it's emphasizing stakeholder engagement, reaching out to those who these solutions will affect. Next is workforce housing, making sure our workforce is able to be housed and therefore we can remain economically productive during this scenario. Wetlands and natural flood management in ours as well. Reconsidering the built environment. This may include updating building codes and the like. Reconsidering multimodal transportation, making sure that we have micro transportation, multimodal transportation to be able to remain resistant in the face of scenarios such as this one. Pursuing a circular economy to eliminate these supply chain risks that may be interrupted in the event of a natural disaster or general economic downturn. Emphasizing cross-sector coordination and partnerships during this time. Allocation of services to rural communities, which can get left by the wayside in times like this. Agricultural and environmental interface, basically ensuring that our food systems and supply planning are still in place. And this last one was a great point made at the end, collaborating with AmeriCorps for funding and assistance, and that also kind of falls under cross-sector coordination and partnerships. But if I missed anything in either of those impacts or solutions, please let me know.
Nicely done, Sebastian. You covered us well. And then we had one more group in the scenario B arena, and that was Rob and Christine's group.
Thanks. Yeah, we had a great discussion. A lot of our discussion on the impacts kind of focused sort of on the natural resources side of things. And so we noted that in our scenario, we would certainly be seeing a lot more damage outside of the 100-year floodplain, noting that FEMA floodplain maps would be less effective, and it'd be really difficult to update and map the new 100-year floodplains and kind of figure out where we're likely to see damage to structures inside and outside of that mapped area. We noted that wildfires would be difficult to predict and control, and that people might start to consider moving out of high hazard areas, which could lead to migration of communities from, say, mountain towns, which would have big impacts on local economies and housing supply. If we're experiencing more frequent and intense wildfires, that leads to an increased loss of property. That might also lead to bigger housing shortages and increased housing prices. With the increased heat in our scenario, we're likely to see things like shorter ski seasons, rafting seasons, which would impact sectors like local economies and tourism and the rec industry as well. We also, if we're seeing sort of this migration out of more mountain or rural communities into urban areas, it's going to put a lot of increased pressure on infrastructure like water supply that, we would probably be looking for those resources from rural areas that are already hit hard. We'd also might see some energy insecurity or issues around energy insecurity as, say, the cost to heat or cool homes becomes more expensive, and it might lead to future housing insecurities. Wasn't all bad though in our scenario. We were thinking that location neutral job opportunities might expand and enable people to live where they choose, which could also see some cost savings for businesses. People moving away from high risk areas might lead to conditions where we're seeing improvements in wildlife migration or ecological function of rivers and watersheds. We might see enhancement of the growth in the tech sector here in Colorado and innovations across other sectors. And that we also might see a political will to have more long-term solutions for things like housing instability and people experiencing homelessness. When it comes to solutions, we sort of started to see some themes around opportunities or access to opportunities, strengthen partnerships across state government, local government, and the private sector, leveraging existing state efforts, incentivizing action, and measuring impacts. And so, some of the solutions we talked about were developing appropriate paths for community engagement that allow for creative and meaningful engagement with diverse communities across the state. Leveraging some of the existing opportunities that state agencies are working on. We talked about how the Water Conservation Board is working on fluvial hazard zone protocol to map, where we're likely to see where the rivers occupied or may occupy in the future, and that can help communities sort of map out areas of high impact. They're also developing model ordinances for communities to map out those areas of impact, and so that would maybe lead to improved land use decisions around areas for new development or decisions being made to rebuild in high hazard areas. CDOT is integrating resilience into transportation and decisions around that, and so maybe that's something that state agencies need to be proactive in allocating resiliency resources into operations. We talked about leveraging public-private partnerships so that we can leverage the expertise and other resources that private sector can provide. Increasing funding for support for those who are experiencing homelessness, whether it's different services, treatments, other kinds. Sort of in terms of incentivizing action, looking at energy rebates for retrofitting houses to be proactive in terms of those types of activities. Looking at different funding opportunities that the state has around sort of, making those changes. And sort of measuring impacts, benchmarking and exploring, or looking at benchmarking and kind of exploring what other communities that are addressing climate change are doing. And another sort of example is that CDOT is creating performance measures to inform its business decisions. So looking to replicate maybe those across state agencies.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. So let's move to our scenario C groups. And so we have a team with Marguerite and Lynn and Reed.
Yes, I'll be reporting out for our scenario. Just to kind of refresh the other groups, scenario C was some of the conditions were declining tourism and agricultural industries, population loss in rural communities, and lack of economic opportunities and severe socioeconomic inequality leading to widespread conflict and civil unrest. So some of the impacts of this scenario that we identified are challenges with public sector financing caused by a decline in tax revenue, homelessness and housing market impacts, positive and negative impacts to natural ecosystems. So in rural communities, there might be this kind of more protection because there's less population there, but that means that you're transferring some of those natural resources to more urban communities. So a little bit plus and minus. And then restructuring of the economy and public services. And a lot of the impacts and solutions were kind of mentioned before, which is really great. We're seeing a lot of kind of synergy and agreement across these different scenarios. And I want to definitely acknowledge my group. We just, there was impacts and solutions coming out of the chat box constantly. So really appreciate that. So some of the solutions that we came up with, we kind of have an overarching one that we identified, which were policies that directly address the existing inequities in a couple of different buckets. And so then under that umbrella, really exploring co-location and adaptable infrastructure, which was mentioned before. So transitioning from the single-use mindset to more multi-use resiliency hubs and different things like that. We also talked about expansion of healthcare, especially for migrant workers and unemployed individuals. And then that kind of cross-sector and cross-scale partnerships, public-private investment to incentivize new residents and support local economies. So whether that be redirecting land use or other type of incentive programs. That was kind of, I think, the major themes that we covered in our group.
Thank you, Lynn. And rounding us out with the last scenario C group, we have Melissa, Erica, Andy, and Max's group.
Great, yeah, thanks. So just building on many of those things from you, Lynn, We focused a lot on the rural communities and how they would really be experiencing impacts. The economic downturn impacts a lot of the different ways that would affect folks, and that they'd be simultaneously, experiencing revenue losses and climate change, weather events. So really thinking about our communities, we thought a lot about the diversity of communities and the equity or just sort of differences in how these impacts are going to affect our different communities, and thinking some about how that will affect the need to tailor resources and opportunities for those communities to respond, or that are responsive to the fact that different communities will really be experiencing different things. So that was one of the underlying impacts that we looked at, as well as revenue impacts to those communities, as well as potentially tax increases driven by the Tabor formula. We talked also about how agricultural decline might really affect water utilities and encourage water transfers to urban use away from ag, and some of the concerns about that. We talked a lot as well about shifts in the energy sector, so that the predicted increases in renewables would be also potentially impacting our fossil fuels industry, and also, again, impacting rural communities' economics. And then we talked about the exacerbating inequity, as well as just sort of new types of equity division. So equity being, we have ways that we describe that, but equity being described as a difference between those with job stability and those without job stability. So just kind of reframing that issue. We also talked about some positive impacts. We talked about some opportunities that might be available in communities that have experienced they've been really stressed with limited housing supply, that have had really intensive recreational user impacts in their surrounding natural resources. And so when we started talking about solutions, some of the things that we talked about over there were thinking about ways that we could take advantage of those opportunities. So transitioning then to solutions, there were, again, kudos to our group, many ideas. We did find it hard to sum up into just a few things, but a couple that popped forward were the need to diversify local economies, including really emphasizing our cultural resources and other elements of the economy. We talked a lot about retraining and transitioning workforce from declining sectors, including an idea, some discussion about resiliency or restoration core, jobs core, sort of that green transition that Megan talked about. We talked a fair amount about housing and the potential opportunity in a down economy in some of these places that have just had unbelievably tight housing markets to potentially acquire and preserve some units in a more affordable stock. Also the opportunity to build more energy efficient and more resilient homes potentially going forward. A couple last things. We talked a lot about access to capital, and some folks have talked about this, but so capital for the transition. So both the local governments as well as small businesses, particularly talking about some kind of a resiliency bank or a revolving loan fund. And then last, and this echoes so many groups, we talked a lot about capacity building and information sharing, and the need to do that across communities as new ideas are generated, as well as across scales of government. So there was lots more, but that's our quick 3 minutes.
Thanks so much, Erica. So just in the final stretch here, Judy and I have been sort of synthesizing the synthesis, per se, and just wanted to offer a few final reflections and observations. You may notice that a lot of these scenarios kind of play on one another. They sort of, scenario A in some ways can lead to scenario B, which in some ways can lead to scenario C. The flood fire cycle, the impacts on our agriculture and tourism industries, they're inextricably linked. And so, we separated them out for purposes of today's activity, but they really are quite intertwined and necessary to think about on these macro system levels, and just really appreciate everybody's participation in the conversation. Some of the preliminary concepts that we've been identifying through this process today are still holding true in my mind, definitely adding some new concepts as well. But as Anne mentioned earlier, we've talked about a lot about comprehensive and equitable access to technology being an overarching theme. I'm seeing that be true, and also hearing the conversation today around some of the unintended consequences of access to broadband technology in rural areas, and the potential gentrification and impacts to the rural communities, and not to overlook that. Same with lots of emphasis on local leadership and capacity building, and also partnerships across sectors, across types of organizations, government, public, nonprofit, tribal, and the like. Market solutions and financing mechanisms for natural resource protection, but also for infrastructure reinvestment and housing. Flexibility and agility in navigating change, and just sort of this cross-sector collaboration, and really working across different scales, and inviting others to the table is definitely coming through in all of the conversations. Housing, and just the housing challenges we currently face, and how those might become more pronounced, and needing to really be creative in including those most impacted in those solutions. And then finally, land use, coordinated land use and natural resource planning, particularly water, but also wildfire and forest health, all very intertwined and related to our watershed health. Judy, I know you were going to take a few minutes and share a few overarching themes as well, and then I'll kind of lead us through our next steps.
Maybe just in 1 minute or so, I would say that, wow, what an interesting experience to do this exercise today under scenarios in an interdisciplinary approach versus in our sector specific solutions. So as Anne said, we had like 250 ideas that we were organizing and coalescing and synthesizing based on that first approach with the idea to test today. And while they largely, as Shelby just said, corroborate, I think today created a much more rich set of solutions. So we have some good work to go back and really build these out with the level of thinking today. I'll just say, speaking from my group, when you have 150 people split out into 7 groups, my group, we did have very strong coverage across all 6 sectors, all 3 lenses, all 3 geographic scales. So it made for really an interesting conversation. How many times people were using terminology like systems thinking was really insightful and encouraging. I will say there were some things missing from our sector-based approach then compared to today that I'm like, oh yeah, of course. The discussion around circular economy, sharing economy was very important to our group. I'm glad that, thank you to Beth for chiming in on that, and others chiming in the chat. We likewise had just chat going like crazy. So sharing economy, really the interesting, some of it was very philosophical and some of it was very granular about this dynamic tension between self-reliance and neighborhood and community reliance being hyper important, but that also we're almost in this place because we need to also make sure that we're focusing on good governance and good civic infrastructure to support local self-reliance. And then I guess I'll just close with my final aha that some people in our group were talking about, kind of looking, here we had walked down this journey, what does it look like in 2025? And some people brought some really great perspective, like let's look backward. You know, what models worked, conservation corps, other things, you know, what things have really worked well for us in the past under stress conditions. And it reminded me of my concept personally, my journey in sustainability. I say that everything I ever learned in sustainability, I learned from my father, the prior generations, not the future generations. And he's a Depression baby, a World War II veteran, 96 years old, and just so much of what we learned from maybe 100 years ago, especially when we talk about self-reliance. So I thought that was interesting that the past came up, not just the future, and what we have to learn from the past in our group. So that is kind of some of my synthesis of the synthesis. Hooray for cognitive diversity and systems thinking. I think it really produced a much higher quality product that we can continue to build upon and look forward to our next summit, where we get the more challenging opportunity to really, to Anne's point, start to align around good implementation infrastructures to bring these holistic solutions to life.
Okay, so the very quick next steps here. We have on the left side here just a handful of summary highlights of what's happening on the engagement side of things, but each one of these bullets has a robust sort of strategy and plan behind it. We'll be meeting with our sector-based teams again in August to review the results of today and also keep moving the conversation forward around solution prioritization and developing more tactical strategies. Also engaging in specific roundtable conversations more on a topical level with certain entities and just different groups that we haven't necessarily connected with yet in the process. Save the date for September 28th, 2 to 4 p.m. That's another Monday afternoon. That's looking like our likely option for our third and final Resilience Summit. And at that time, we will get into our align phase and really have a conversation around priorities for the updated resiliency framework. And so I want to hand it over to Chantal for the closing remarks, and as well as Anne and Rob, if you have any final thoughts. You know, we're at the top of the hour. Hopefully people can stick around for the digital happy hour if you're interested. So.
Great, well, thank you. I'll just jump in. First of all, what Perry Burnap just said in the chat is really beautiful. So maybe I don't need to say anything because she just said something so great. What I will say though is this process reminds me of some imagery that I heard about a couple years ago called being on the balcony. And if you can imagine that the state is a theater, and as resiliency professionals, our job is to sit on the balcony. Our job is to watch the whole stage. And our job is to be watching the movement of all of the players and how they all work together. It's to watch the score of the music to make sure it's fitting in at the right time in the right place. We have this critical opportunity to sit on that balcony here in Colorado so we can orchestrate really the whole play and influence the experience of everyone involved. And so really from downtowns to Denver Water, from the federal agencies on the phone to Fair Play, from Green Latinos to Leadville, I know Anne and the team really want to thank you for taking the time. We are all creating this work plan for the state together, so I know that really great things are in our future. And listening to everything that you're all talking about, this is in great hands. So from DOLA, we just wanted to say thank you, and I'll pass it back to Anne.
I think you've summed it up so well in the comments in the chat. So thank you everybody for taking the time. I'm energized and excited for us to just really push it through and come out with the action plan that is emerging. So thank you again, and please join us for a little virtual happy hour now.
Yep. So folks, feel free to drop off. Otherwise, take a few minutes and take a quick break. I need to feed my dog because she's outside my door barking. And we'll thank you all for your time and just a really wonderful session.
Yeah. So a short intermission as with Chantal's analogy of the theater balcony. So we'll pause for a minute.